On this Thanksgiving weekend, I've entitled my talk, Thanksgiving More Than Just a Fantasy. I told Faith, my wife, that I don't feel qualified to speak about Thanksgiving because I'm a grumbler. Not surprisingly, she readily affirmed that I am indeed a grumbler. But then she thoughtfully paused and added, Sometimes you don't grumble. Big sigh. I tell you this because my sermons are never only for other people, for you. One of my primary philosophies of preaching is that my sermon doesn't have value unless it first challenges me. And that's never more true than when I talk about Thanksgiving. So you have my permission to listen to this as if I'm only talking to myself. At times it seems that more than anything, Thanksgiving gives us permission to slip into a world of fantasy where we only pretend that all is right with the world. At least that's the message we can be excused for gaining from some of the classic images of Thanksgiving. Norman Rockwell's famous painting, which depicts a multi-generational family sitting around a dinner table in joyous anticipation of a perfect turkey meal, was significantly entitled Freedom from Want. It's the kind of picture that looks too good to be true, as if it's the fantasy of what we wish Thanksgiving to be. We could be forgiven for concluding that was because Norman Rockwell painted during a simpler time. But his painting graced the Saturday Evening Post in 1943, smack dab in the middle of World War II. When I look at that kind of picture or think of my own wishes to spend a day celebrating the joys of family, I am forced to ask, is Thanksgiving merely a momentary escape from the unwelcome reality of a hard life? Or does Thanksgiving transform life? After all, Thanksgiving is not a natural human reaction. Beginning with Adam and Eve, who would rather complain that they were forbidden from eating from one solitary tree, instead of celebrating the garden of delights in which they lived, humanity's propensity toward grumbling has been on display. The multitude of people that Moses led out of Egypt have long epitomized unthankfulness. The adrenaline-fueled excitement of their daring night escape had probably not yet subsided before the people decided that slavery in Egypt was more desirable than freedom in the desert. Throughout the Bible, the escapees from Egypt are portrayed as grumblers who failed to be thankful for the many advantages with which God blessed them. 1 Corinthians 10 paints a vivid contrast between the advantages the former Egyptian slaves enjoyed and their negative reactions to what God was doing. And we are reminded that we also need to be careful with the way in which we envision their flight to the desert. Our inclination can be to view the nation under the leadership of Moses as refugees, arousing images of current-day dehumanizing refugee camps, which makes us feel sorry for them. From the Bible's perspective, though, the people fleeing Egypt were not forlorn refugees, but were well cared for pilgrims traveling to a new land. They weren't even poor. By the end of the famous 10 plagues, the Bible tells us that the Egyptian people were only too happy to give the Hebrew people large amounts of gold and silver and herds and flocks of livestock just so they would leave. Listen to how the Apostle Paul described their status in 1 Corinthians 10. For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and that they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. So notice the advantages the people enjoyed. Now, to our ears, being under the cloud can sound ominous, but the cloud was more like a safety blanket. Exodus 13 tells us that God went ahead of the people in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire at night, meaning that God's presence was continually visible. Unlike we who can't see God and are tempted to question God's existence, the Hebrew people only had to glance up to see God's presence. And not only could they see God's presence, they experienced a legendary miracle. When they were trapped between the proverbial rock and hard place in the form of the Red Sea in front and Pharaoh's armies behind, they watched the waters of the Red Sea pile up on two sides, leaving a corridor for them to walk through. If that weren't enough, after they were all safe on the other side, they got to turn and watch those walls of water collapse on the army that was chasing them, drowning their enemies. That sight was so inspiring that Moses and his sister Miriam composed a song about it. Lack of food is a pressing survival issue in a desert. But despite being in the desert, they didn't have to hunt for food a single day in 40 years. All they had to do was go out in the morning and harvest the manna that tasted like wafers made with honey. Lack of water can be an even greater survival problem in the desert, but they didn't go thirsty. When they ran out of water, God told Moses to hit a rock with his staff, and water came out. The reason for the Bible highlighting the blessings the Hebrew people under Moses' leadership received is obvious. They should have been overwhelmed with thanksgiving. They had been rescued by means of one of the greatest miracles ever. They enjoyed financial wealth. They experienced the visible presence of God with them, and they ate food for which they did not work. Instead of enjoying those blessings, the next words in 1 Corinthians 10 tell us that nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. How could this be? The sad truth is that we can never receive enough blessings to overcome our ability to grumble. Rather than being a celebration of thanksgiving, the desert pilgrimage became a history of grumbling. 1 Corinthians 10 tells us that some became idolaters, some indulged in revelry, in immorality, and most critically it says this, and do not grumble, as some of them did and were killed by the destroying angel. The advice that Corinthians leaves us is to use the example of the Hebrew people as a personal warning about our own inclination to grumble. 1 Corinthians 10 contains a promise that is often quoted, but not necessarily in the context in which it is given. It says this, so if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. And then these well-known words, no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. What is the temptation from which God promises to provide a way out? Within the context of 1 Corinthians 10, it's the temptation to grumble. It's really quite simple. Grumbling inevitably gets us in trouble. Grumbling creates dissatisfaction, which leads to self-destructive behavior. The more we grumble about anything in life, the more unhappy we become, and the more likely we are to get caught up in the same kind of bad behavior in which the nation of Israel engaged. The problem with getting rid of grumbling is that you can't just stop. The only way to get rid of grumbling is to replace it. It's like darkness. The only way to get rid of darkness is to replace it with light. The only way to get rid of grumbling is to replace it with thanksgiving. And that's why 1 Corinthians 10 goes on to say, "Therefore, my dear friends, flee from idolatry." And I think grumbling becomes a pathway to idolatry. I think that's what it's saying. I speak to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. Is not the cup of thanksgiving for which we give thanks a participation in the blood of Christ? And is not the bread that we break a participation in the body of Christ? These words are a reference to communion, and we always give thanks when we celebrate communion. What's uncomfortable, though, is that communion links us to Jesus' suffering, and our human reaction is to never connect suffering with thanksgiving. We normally think of Thanksgiving as a reaction to the good things in life we've experienced. And even then, like the nation of Israel, we can find it hard to be thankful. But from the Bible's perspective, Thanksgiving is not intended to be reactive, but active. Thanksgiving is meant to be much more than the warm emotion we feel when life is good. Thanksgiving is intended to be the protective armor with which we approach life. Thanksgiving becomes a powerful protection against self-destructive behavior when we choose to embrace it as a lifestyle. Just like light and darkness can't occupy the same space, grumbling and thanksgiving can't coexist. And just like light will always win over darkness, thanksgiving will always win over grumbling. If we only base our thanksgiving on our perception of how life has treated us, the needle measuring the level of thankfulness in the world might be flirting with the red zone. COVID has done a pretty good job of giving the whole world an excuse to grumble. When we combine the effects of COVID with our personal struggles with finances, with health, with relationships, we can feel more than justified in setting the table of our own pity party. But what if the Bible is right? What if I determined to put on Thanksgiving as an armor of protection at the start of my day? What if I use that spirit of thanksgiving to keep my mind away from all the perceived injustices which turn me into a grumbler? Maybe if I embrace Thanksgiving as a transformational power, when Thanksgiving Day rolls around next year, faith will say, "You only grumble sometimes."